Hello everyone, I'm Geoff Stalley, the leader of the Booktopia team here in Australia, and I'm thrilled today to host a candid chat and interview with one of Australia's most well-known politicians, the 25th Prime Minister and the second longest serving Prime Minister, Mr. John Howard. Welcome, Mr. Howard.
Good morning, nice to be with you.
Thank you. Now before we kick it off, we'd love to hear from you, so let us know if you've ordered one of Mr. Howard's books, or his new books, A Sense of Balance, that we're going to cover off today. Okay, let's jump straight into the book. Mr. Howard, The Sense of Balance. It's a great read. I took it home last night and
glad
read it.
to hear that. It's always a good start.
It is, and it's absolutely some great insights into how the political parties in Australia work, and I think you describe our system, our political system, as a little bit Swiss, a little bit American, infused into the Westminster system. In your view, do we have it right? Do we have the best system in the world?
I wouldn't be so bold as to say we've got the best system in the world, but we have a better system than any other country that we normally compare ourselves with. We have an infinitely better system than the Americans. I admire the Americans for a lot of things, but their political system has got a lot of big flaws. I mean, one of the great advantages of the Australian political system is that we don't have a Bill of Rights. Now, that may sound counterintuitive. People would say, heavens above. The Bill of Rights, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that it hands too much power to the courts. And they decide things and then they change their mind and people get angry with the first decision, and then those who were happy with the first decision are angry with the second one, and they say, what about us? We haven't been consulted. Because in America, and you've seen this recently in relation to the Supreme Court's decisions on abortion rights, and I'm not wanting to initiate a discussion on the substance of that issue, but they are things that should be decided by the Parliament, by Congress, or representatives of the people. And the fact that in America so many of those issues are decided by the courts, by the Supreme Court, that causes a lot of anger, and it's one of the reasons why the participation of Americans in the political process is much lower than it would otherwise be.
Yes, no, you're 100% right. That how that's played out in America has been quite divisive.
Well, it's very divisive. When the original decision 40 years ago in Roe versus Wade, that was divisive. People who didn't agree with it were angry that the court had taken it upon themselves to tell them what the law was, not to interpret a law that had been laid down by Congress. And now, all these years later, that's turned on its head. Yeah. So you've got everybody unhappy.
Yeah, everywhere. Yeah, well, Australia was re-educated perhaps during the COVID environment we've gone through in the last few years around our federation model and the power of the states versus the power of the Commonwealth. Do you think there's scope to change, or where would you change?
There's always scope to improve the distribution between the Commonwealth and the states, but it's not going to change fundamentally. What COVID revealed was that the states had powers that they, for the first time in many cases, exercised since Federation. A lot of people said, gee, the states are throwing their weight around there, taking it upon themselves to do things that they shouldn't be doing. That wasn't the case. They've always had those powers, it's just that they haven't been needed in the past. And I don't think Australians would vote for any major change that took power away from the states. I think people are pretty happy with the balance that exists at the moment. It's not perfect, and there were flaws and there were mistakes, but fundamentally, for a big country geographically, although a small population, our federal system works pretty well. And we are a fairly conservative lot when it comes to changing our laws. We don't like too much change. because people feel that the federal model we have here has worked pretty well.
I guess the next area to probably just touch on, or you spend a bit of time in the book, is around kind of factionalisation and the parties themselves, because as we've just chatted, the system seems to be right and workable and one of the best in the world. It becomes down then to how the parties operate.
Yes, I think you've got to distinguish between the political system we have, which I think is pretty good for the reasons I've just outlined, and the operation of political parties within that system. And there's certainly a lot of evidence that over the past 20 or 30 years, the membership of political parties in the Western world, not just in Australia, has become more narrow, that there are too many people coming into Parliament now whose only life experience has been a political one, in the narrower sense of that word. I mean, you often have the example of somebody goes to university on the Labor Party side of politics. They go to university, they then might work for a union, and then they might work in a politician's office, and they get chosen to be a candidate. Well, that's fine, but not if it's overdone. And I quote in my book the occupations of the last cabinet of Ben Chifley before Menzies defeated him in 1949, and it had an interesting background. There were farmers, there were people who'd been in the army. Now that was understandable because of proximity of World War II. There was a tobacconist. Now that's practically a criminal offence these days. And you had some people, a publican. It was quite a mixture of people. Now, by comparison, the new cabinet of Mr Albanese, and I'm not criticising them, they've only just got there. We'll wait and see how they go. But most of them have had a background in machine politics or the trade union movement. And I can't find any people who've had a small business background. So it's become narrow. And you can say the same thing about the Liberal Party. I'm not just singling out the ALP, it's true. And I think one of the issues that political parties face is to make certain that their membership is more broadly based. And that's quite hard because we are now of a generation that doesn't like joining organisations. I quote in the book a book that was written by an American sociologist, Robert Putnam. It's called Bowling Alone. And he made the interesting discovery that going to a bowling alley, which years ago used to be a group pursuit, in America is now far less so, that far more people go to bowl alone. And it was a metaphor for the way in which people had stopped joining organisations. And it's something that is true in Australia. And you can trace the decline in the disposition of people who join organisations. They might retain an interest in something, but they're very reluctant to adhere to a formal group. Now, if that applies right across the board, it obviously applies to political parties. And of course, what has now happened is that political parties are increasingly made up of people whose only activity has been in and around politics. Now, that's fine up to a point, but it does mean you get a very narrow focus. It does mean there's a lot more factional rivalry and factions, in my experience, a little better than preferment cooperatives. They're groups of people who cluster together to promote each other within their chosen political party. Now, it's okay if their driving force is a particular political issue that's of real substance, but my experience has been that although there's an element of that, it's not the dominant force.
Yeah, and you talk also about the importance of the broad church.
Yes, it's an expression that I used a lot in relation to the Liberal Party. I borrowed from the description of the Anglican Church, not that I was in any way likening the Liberal Party to a particular denomination or religion. It's a party that's open to people of all faith or no faith. That's not something that it has a view on. But the point I was making is that everybody is a mixture of what you might call conservative feelings or classical liberal feelings. Everybody on the centre-right side of politics. I mean, I have very conservative views on some issues, but I had what I regarded as classical liberal views, even on occasions radical views on other things. And I think you have to maintain the breadth of that. And people who say, oh, the Liberal Party is not open to people who've got smaller liberal views, or is not open to people who have conservative views, its true mission is this or that, they're wrong. That's not its true mission. It's always been a composite of the two traditions.
Yeah, and you actually do describe yourself as an economic liberal and a social conservative. Has this changed over time, or how
it's probably, I suppose, changed a bit at the margin, but not fundamentally. I mean, for example, I spent a great deal of my time in politics arguing the cause of industrial relations change and reform, and that was a manifestation of my classical liberal view. I took the approach that the individual should have a right to determine his or her working arrangement, subject to some guaranteed minimum conditions to prevent any exploitation. But above and beyond that, people should be able to decide the terms of their employment, negotiate directly with their employer. And this, of course, is very different in approach from the general view of the centre-left of politics that believes that all of these things should be negotiated on an industry-wide level between unions and employers. I don't agree with that. And if people want to go along with that, it's fine, but if they don't, they shouldn't be prevented from striking their own bargains with their employer.
Yeah, no, that's true. And you actually identify the industrial relations reform and even GST as some of your key achievements.
Yeah. Well, the GST was, of course, a huge economic reform. But deep down, when you examine it, what the GST symbolised was a decision that more of what people spent should be taxed and less of what they earned should be taxed. And that really means, at heart, that people should be given more freedom of choice about when and on what they should pay tax. Now, that's not the main argument for a GST, but it is consistent with my classical liberal views.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I guess you've also been involved and probably helped a number of other major reforms, including privatisation, deregulating the financial system, even if they were from the opposition side, where you were forming a bipartisan view on it and helping, a good idea, if you like, come to truth.
Oh, well, certainly. The two you cite. I mean, when we were in opposition, we argued very strongly. This was when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister. We argued very strongly for privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, of Qantas and Australian Airlines. They were all government-owned enterprises. And at the beginning, both Bob Hawke and Paul Keating said, oh, that's ridiculous, it's bad, and we're totally opposed to it, and it's a slash-and-burn exercise. When they got into power, they decided over time that they thought it probably wasn't a bad idea to do those things, so they embraced them as policies, and when they did, I took the view that we should support it. I mean, not only was it good policy, but it would have been hypocritical to have opposed something that we supported in opposition just because it was being implemented by the government, although the government had changed its tune. That's politics, but we did that, and I well remember an occasion I mentioned in the book when, on the eve of the last budget that Keating government brought down. It was introduced by Ralph Willis. Kim Beazley, who was then the leader of the opposition, I'm sorry, not leader of the opposition, he was Deputy Prime Minister, and he rang me and said, "John, is it still your policy to support the sale of the rest of the Commonwealth Bank?" And I said, yes. He said, "Well, we'll need your support to get it through the Senate because the Democrats and the Greens are opposed to it." And I said, "Well, we want to see the legislation, but our policy hasn't changed." And we went ahead and supported that, which was really the mainstay of their budget. Now, that was an example of just sensibly agreeing with a policy that we'd always argued for, and for us to have done anything other than to have supported it would have been absurd.
Yeah, and you argue that the bipartisanship was never really reciprocated.
No, it wasn't. It was a one-way street. When we got into government and we wanted to privatise Telstra, the Labor Party never supported that, but they always thought argued there was a difference. There wasn't really. They just took a different attitude.
Yeah. Moving to more contemporary environments, and there's a number of areas in the book where you discuss what's happened in recent times or could happen in the future. One of the things is you're actually a big fan of nuclear power. Do you think we'll ever get
Yeah, well, I hope so. I think that nuclear power has to be part of the long-term energy future. And there's no doubt that nuclear power can, along with fossil fuels, provide baseload power capacity. And I find it hard to accept a world in which we're totally reliant on renewables. I'm a bit of an agnostic when it comes to the whole climate change debate. Now, there's a lot of evidence in favour of what is now being pursued by most governments around the world, but there's also a lot of scientific evidence that nuclear power is a clean source of energy. I can understand why people have recoiled in horror because of the fear of a nuclear holocaust, but the likelihood of that has diminished over time, and I just believe that if we are serious about plotting a sustainable energy future, nuclear power has got to be part of it. And you can see what is now happening in Europe. Many countries that had built a heavy reliance on nuclear power and then walked away from them are now trying to bring it back. I mean, at one stage, something like 80% of France's electricity was sourced from nuclear, and there were nuclear power plants in Britain and in Germany, and they were turned away from, but now people are starting to see, because of the challenges of gas and coal supplies, particularly the former, because of Russia's power in that area, they're starting to see the wisdom of the nuclear approach.
Yeah, you also cover immigration and housing changes.
Yeah,
to housing.
Well, in my view on it, I'm a supporter of immigration. I think immigration has done good things for Australia. That doesn't mean to say that you have to have the maximum number of immigrants at all times. You obviously have to modulate according to economic need and economic circumstances, and I think there's no doubt that on occasions the volume of immigration has had an impact on housing prices, but the biggest single problem with the cost of buying the first home, which is still the great Australian dream, is that over the years governments, usually state and local government, have really put restrictions on where people can build and how far out they can build, and I mean, everybody who's got a house wants a set of policies that keeps that house as valuable as possible, because it's the major asset most of us have. But on the other hand, if you do that, you inevitably hold up the price, and getting into the housing market now is getting harder than it used to be. We had a surge in home ownership in the 60s and 70s, but that has tapered off. And it's still about 2/3, but Sydney is one of the most expensive cities in the Western world, and when it comes to housing. And it's becoming more difficult for people who rent. And we tend to look at the housing issues through the prism of interest rates and the upfront cost, and they're important. But the long-term explanation for the high cost of housing in this country is the old economic laws of supply and demand. We don't have enough supply of cheap land, and we have a growing demand, and that, of course, is where levels of immigration come into it. So although I'm a very strong supporter of immigration and know how much it's helped our country, we have to have some regard to the impact of immigration, particularly on our big cities like Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah. Let's turn to China.
Yes.
So from, I guess, quoting Shakespeare with Mrs. Howard to joint sittings of Parliament in tandem with the US, where's it all gone wrong?
Well, I don't think it's gone wrong from an Australian point of view. I'm not saying that we've been perfect, but one of the first points I'd make is that over the last 20 or 30 years, the attitude of Australian governments to China has been largely bipartisan. I don't have any criticism of what the new Australian government, the Albanese government, has done in relation to China. I think most of what has been said by the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister about that have been largely consistent with the approach we took. China is our best customer, and it is the case that when the global financial crisis hit, that the huge market we had with China in fossil fuels, in iron ore, in gas and coal, helped keep our economy afloat. So we ought to bear that in mind. My view is that China growth has been very good for the world. It's helped lift a lot of people out of poverty. It's a very big country, population-wise, but it does have some long-term problems that too few people appreciate. And the first of those long-term problems is that China is an ageing country. China will grow old before she grows rich. Whereas a country like Japan has a declining population, Japan was already much richer than China when that decline commenced. Now, this is going to have a huge impact because you're going to have a growing number of older retired people in China relying on a diminishing cohort of younger people to support them. I used the metaphor of a slow-turning ocean liner to say that the slowest turning ocean liner of the 21st century will no doubt be trying to reverse China's population decline. China had, as everybody knows, a one-child policy. Then, having realised that that was creating long-term economic challenges, they then turned it into, in certain circumstances, to a two-child policy, and more recently even a three-child. Now that indicates to me confusion of a massive order at the top levels of decision-making in that country. So I'm not as mesmerised by China as many people are. I recognise her strength, and the leadership of China has changed. The current leader is more aggressive, is more belligerent, is prone to issue threats, compared with his predecessors. They were still doctrinaire communists and believed in an authoritarian country, don't get me wrong. The freedoms that we take for granted here haven't been practiced in China for for a long, long time in the living memory of just about anybody in that country. So, but the attitude of Xi Jinping's two predecessors to the rest of the world was different than is his, and I think that's quite important. The other thing to bear in mind about China is that as more and more people grow up in relative affluence, and China has now probably 300 to 400 million people who have what you might loosely call a middle-class living standard. And those people who've always enjoyed comfort are going to increasingly want to express their views politically. That's my opinion. I think if you are born into poverty and you transition into relative comfort in your lifetime, you're more disposed to thank the people who've responsible for that, or thank your circumstances that they have changed for the better. On the other hand, if you are born into relative affluence, you take that for granted and you say, what's next? And the what next for those people is to have greater freedom of political expression. And as that number of people in the middle class grows, there's going to be more people who will say, we want our say, and that'll have an impact on their political system. Now, many people disagree with this, but we'll see.
Excellent. You're clearly a fan of the Queen. Looking at the people you've met around the world and how you've interacted with leaders and seriously important people in different areas, where would you put the Queen in? Oh,
well, she's in a special case. Look, I am a fan of hers, both as an individual, but I'm also a fan of the system. Now, I understand there's a substantial section of the Australian population has a different view, and I've always acknowledged that. And when we had the referendum on the Republic 20 years ago, I was Prime Minister then, and I said from the outset that as far as the Parliamentary Liberal Party was concerned, we'd have a free vote. We wouldn't try and have a party line, and I reckon about 70% of the members supported the status quo, and 30% went for change. My opinion is that right now there's probably more support for her than there was even then. She has done a remarkable job, and of course she's lasted longer. You've got to go back when I was 12 when she came to the throne, and I think Joseph Stalin was still the dictator of the Soviet Union. We held the ashes, which that has remained constant. But I think the system works well. The great advantage of our system is that through circumstances of history, we have ended up with a model of government that produces a non-political head of state. Now, some people say that's unacceptable, okay, if they want to keep arguing for change, but I never found any identity problem. I've dealt with dozens of leaders of countries in Asia when I was Prime Minister, and both before and afterwards, and I never found any of them saying, oh, this is confusing, you've got the same Queen as the Brits. It just never entered. It just wasn't there. I mean, people knew the distinctive Australian identity very well. Lee Kuan Yew, who most people regard as the elder statesman of the Asian region post-World War II, remarkable man, he once said, I think, addressing the National Press Club in Australia, he couldn't understand what the discussion was all about because he didn't think that our system of government, if it were changed to a republic, would make any difference to the attitude people had towards Australia. He just said, I don't understand what it's about. I mean, he didn't say it was anything other than our business, and of course it is only our business. But it was interesting that he had that take. I'm not in favour of altering something that's working. There's an old aphorism that says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and it's pretty true.
Yeah, very much so. Margaret Whitlam once unfairly or scoffed at you and Mrs. Howard for holding hands. How important has she been to your career or life?
Marvellous. And I have an enormous amount of respect for Margaret, and she was a great support for Geoff Whitlam. They were a very fine pair. Yes, look, you are fortunate if your life's partner, your wife, in my case, and husband for others, if you have somebody who is interested in what you're doing and provides advice. And Jeanette took the view that I was the one that was elected. She wasn't elected, but she had always been very interested in it, and we're a couple that continue to have a lot of interest in politics and still talk about it in a lively, engaged way.
Yeah. And sport, you...
Well, I remain a follower of cricket as my principal, but not exclusive sporting interest. When I was Prime Minister, I was very close to the Wallabies because it was an Australian team. One of the great things about rugby union in that context, although it was not as widely played as Australian rules, obviously, or rugby league in New South Wales and Queensland, or increasingly, of course, soccer. There's probably more people play soccer at a junior level than any of the other codes. The thing about rugby union is that you can barrack for Australia. The ultimate manifestation, I suppose, of rugby union is the Wallabies. When the Wallabies are doing well, rugby union is doing well. And when we had a time when I was Prime Minister, I had nothing to do with it. It was just serendipity, but we held the World Cup and the Bledisloe Cup and the Cook Trophy, which was then the trophy between England and Australia. And although the Mandela Trophy at that stage had not been inaugurated, we'd have held it if it had been. And to hold them all at this one time was quite an experience, and we've got to work back to it. But sport binds Australians together, and it's something that you should always understand.
Yeah. I think as a politician, you've been one of the few that's understood that connection between Australia and sport, and actually, been part of it.
Oh, very much so. And you don't want to overdo it. You just have to understand that Australians pride themselves on their knowledge of the sports they follow, and they can therefore spot a phony. And I remember when I became Prime Minister, I talked to some of my staff and I said, look, please understand that there are some sports, I know a reasonable amount about. Obviously cricket, I'd played rugby league and rugby union and soccer when I was a younger person, and but I didn't understand anything much about Australian rules because at my age I'd grown up in Sydney at a time when there was no Australian rules. It was decades before Sydney Swans, but I also understood. I played tennis and golf, and I understood those sports quite well. But I said, please don't sort of represent that I know something about sports I don't know anything about. I said, because I'll be spotted very quickly, and they can spot a phony a mile off.
Well, early in your book, you talk a little bit about Mabo, but not in the context of Mabo, but in context of not understanding, or a lot of people not understanding that it was about settled versus invasion.
Yeah.
How do you take those complex sort of situations and communicate them and get the public to really understand?
Well, it's very hard, and you've got to. I mean, my view about the relationship between the Australian public, Australian population, and its Indigenous section is it has been something that we've not handled well. I think I say it represents our greatest blemish in our national story. But I'm not of the view that there is one single symbolic gesture that can solve it. I do think we have to focus on closing the gap, which is, I think, a good way of describing it, removing the disadvantage that people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have in education, health and employment. And that's a slow process. But I know there's a huge debate going on at the moment about the voice. Well, let that debate evolve. But I don't think, no matter what we end up with, that of itself, that is going to do an enormous amount. It might. I'd be surprised. We'll wait and see. But the important thing is that there has to be an acceptance of where we are. If we spend the future re-adjudicating the past, we're not going to achieve anything. I think we have to accept what it is, and that is that this country was settled by the British, and I think there's a lot in the truth. There's a lot of truth in the statement that the best thing that happened to Australia was that we were settled by the British. It was inevitable that the landmass of Australia was going to be colonised by European power, and I think we're fortunate it was the British rather than the competing alternatives at the time. Now, that's not to say they were perfect in anything, but I think one of the clever things Australians have done, and it's one of the reasons why I chose the title Sense of Balance, is we chose the good bits of our British inheritance and not the bad bits. We're not an aristocratic country. There's no class distinctions don't exist in Australia anywhere near to the extent that they exist in Europe. And I think we were very sensible, and it was our nature not to have them. But it is true that over the years we did not treat Indigenous people well. I mean, it was really quite shameful that they weren't included in the census until 1967. Now, there were all sorts of explanations for that, but the net of it was that they weren't included. So that was pretty insulting, and to say the very least. But we have to focus on practical outcomes, what I called, when I was Prime Minister, practical reconciliation. Now, I'm following the debate on the voice, but anything that is divisive will struggle to be accepted. I would not object to there being something in our constitution that acknowledged that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were here before anybody else, because it's true. And you can't argue with something that was so demonstrably true as that. But I doubt very much if those who were pushing for the voice would settle for that. We'll see.
We certainly will. And you describe this really as, the Australian achievement, and
yes,
how that kind of has played out.
I think the Australian achievement is a good way to describe where we have come to in our journey as a nation. We are a cohesive country. I mean, we're not a country that's, despite what we sometimes are told by some commentators, we are not a country that's riven by dispute and acrimony, and we have all the arguments of any society, but we are democratic. We peacefully transfer political power. We've just seen in the last 2 or 3 months peaceful transfer of power. I mean, I led the Liberal Party to 6 elections. I won 4 of them, I lost 2 of them. And I was involved in 1996 in a huge win, and I enjoyed that very much. In 2007, I was heavily defeated. I didn't enjoy that at all, but it happened. And on both of those occasions, there was an acceptance, peaceful transfer of power. Now, unfortunately, we've seen in the United States, and I've been very critical of Donald Trump for this, his unwillingness to accept the verdict of the public. Now, I've studied that carefully. That election wasn't stolen. He lost. And, I can think of some reasons why he did lose. And I was not, might I say, I was not a great fan of Joe Biden. So anything but I did. But the truth is that the system delivered him as president, and much and all as it would have upset Trump, he just sort of accepted it in the way that George H.W. Bush, a gracious man, 41st president, lost after just one term to Bill Clinton, and he accepted it. That's the nature. And when Anthony Albanese won, Scott Morrison accepted it and said so publicly. Now that's how a mature, sensible country behaves. So I don't think Donald Trump did himself any favours. The pressure he so clearly placed on his vice president, who was a thoroughly decent, loyal man who played according to the rules and was playing according to the rules in certifying the outcome, and to him to be subjected to pressure not to use the legal authority he had to produce an outcome that was clearly disputed by the verdict of the American people was wrong.
Excellent. Well, I could sit here and chat to you all day, Mr. Howard. It's been wonderful. One last question. A dinner party, who would you have around your table?
Well, it's pretty hard not to have Don Bradman and William Shakespeare and Winston Churchill. That's a start.
That's a start. There's some amazing people there for sure. Well, the book is A Sense of Balance. It's out very soon, if not already. And I've been chatting today with Mr. Howard, our 25th Prime Minister, and one of our longest-serving politicians ever. So thank you, Mr. Howard. It's been an excellent time with you.
Thank you.